Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Nick Goddard from the Australian Oilseeds Federation, which is the peak industry body for all oilseeds in Australia, particularly canola. And firstly, I'd just like to commend the organisers for OGC for being able to make this happen this year under pretty trying circumstances, but done a great job. And I think this will be a conference for everybody to remember. And I think it'll probably go down in history as maybe the way we'll do things in the future. Anyway, today I'm going to cover a number of points for you, and I really just wanted to talk through canola from an Australian perspective. I'll give a brief overview of the Australian winter cropping system, then the Australian canola trade and production history, looking at the current canola issues and drivers that we're facing as a country, and then I'll look to the future and what we see as being the prospects. So for those not familiar with the Australian cropping system, what we see is really two seasons. So we've got a summer season and a winter cropping season. The summer season, pretty small, it's less than 1 million hectares. It's very much driven through the northern rain that might be coming from the tropics here and over here to bring that rainfall through for the summer crops. And for that, we've got crops like sorghum, cotton and corn. But for us, the area of interest is really the winter cropping section. We are essentially a winter cropping country, and we have over 20 million hectares, sometimes up to 25 million hectares of winter cropping area. And the majority of that is devoted to cereals. So we're seeing 70 to 75% of the area devoted to cereals in a typical year. And but canola and pulses play a very strong role. Those broadleafs play a strong role in the rotation with cereals, and often up to 20%, but typical year around 15%, of which canola is about half that. So around 8% of the rotation in the winter crops would be canola, and as with most winter crops, they're planted around April, May in Australia, grow through the winter, and then are harvested coming into summer in October and November. If we just look at the Australian canola production over the last decade or so, we can see it's quite variable. It sort of fluctuates between a little over 4 million to a little under 2 million. And this is really driven primarily through seasonal variations. So whether it's a drought or whether it's not a drought, basically. Coming into 2020, we're just coming out of a 2-year drought period. We've had a very good start to the season in April and May. Crop prospects are looking pretty good. There are smiles on farmers' faces, which is great. So we're hoping this will be a year of another strong Australian production for all grains, including canola. And but you can see here the variation that we experience as a country with our canola production, particularly according to whether we get the rains that we might expect or not. So a very much weather-dependent production system. And so let's say on an average year, we'll get 3 to 4 million tonnes. And we are highly export dependent as a nation, and we're the number 2 global exporter of canola. If we just have a look at that graph there, over the last 20 years or so, in all but 2 years, we've had an exportable surplus of canola. And that exportable surplus can sometimes range up to 3 million tonnes or more, which has to find homes in the global market. If we just look at our export markets, destinations for the last 5 years or so, you can see that Europe is a huge customer for Australian canola, taking over 3/4 of our canola exports. And that's primarily going, if not solely going, into the biodiesel market, and then followed by Japan, China, the UAE, and Pakistan, and a few others. So Europe, huge destination for Australian canola. We're highly reliant on that for our trade. Now, just looking at some of the current issues and the drivers behind that we face as an Australian canola industry. At a farm level, it's this production variability that we face. It's that range between 2 and 4 million tonnes, and we would never really know until we got the crop in the ground what it's going to be like. So climate variability is a key driver for us, and over time we're seeing those isoheights, those lines of equal rainfall, continuing to migrate towards the coast. So that dry desert region of Australia is just becoming drier and more desert, and it's starting to encroach on those cropping regions. This is a real concern for Australia and Australian farmers, but it's also creating a lot of innovation in the space around varieties that are far more drought and stress tolerant. Also looking at extending that planting window, so to capture more of that summer rain and some of that summer moisture to get germination. So longer season varieties, and also grazing the varieties mid-season to provide some feed for livestock. Chemical use is also an ongoing and growing concern for us as more and more countries start to take a hazard approach to risk assessment rather than a risk approach. And we're obviously seeing this, we've seen this over the last decade or so in the EU, the implication that's had on canola production with the absence of a lot of chemicals. But we're also starting to see this hazard approach beginning to emerge in a lot of our developing nations that look on leading areas like Europe for guidance, but unfortunately misguidance in this case by taking again a hazard approach to setting their own MRLs rather than a sound science and risk-based approach. This is a real concern for us as more and more chemicals get more and more pressure in terms of their ability to be used for crop management. And something that's very specific to Australia is that of farmer-safe seed. Sometimes up to 3/4 of our planting will be from farmer-safe seed, and that has got implications for our yield potential. We're probably holding back our overall productivity by not having more and more hybrids and fresh seed in the system. We can understand why farmers do that. It's because of that climate variability that they don't really invest as heavily as perhaps they should in seed because of that concern as to whether they'll actually get a crop out the other end. And we are seeing the seed companies now starting to put in place programs that share that risk a little bit more, and more of the cost ending up with the harvested grain as an endpoint royalty type payment, so that that risk is shared a little bit more between the farmer and the seed supplier. So that's a positive. On the trade level, from an Australian perspective, that heavy reliance on the EU is a major issue for us. We've got to this point because we've been able to price competitively into Europe. We've been able to supply large amounts of non-GM canola. We've got a freight advantage for canola into Europe, given that about half Australian canola is produced in Western Australia. So that's on the right side of our country for easy access to Europe. More immediately, the issue is around EU biodiesel demand and the impact that COVID-19 has had on overall oil and energy consumption, biodiesel in particular in Europe, and the impact that will have for Australian canola in the current harvest, or the upcoming harvest, I should say. For our last harvest, so November, December 2019, that was predominantly all contracted and shipped prior to the impact of COVID really hitting oil demand. So that's moved, which is great for us. But in terms of our upcoming harvest, it's unlikely, I think, that mineral oil will get back to $60 a barrel, and it's also unlikely, I think, we'll see an immediate return to sort of biodiesel consumption that we might have seen in the past. So some concerns there for us for our harvest at the end of this year. And of course, all this is happening under an umbrella of global trade uncertainty. We've seen over the last 4 or 5 years a growing changes towards protectionism, and perhaps the WTO beginning to not have the impact that perhaps it was initially envisaged to have with some of these nations that are moving more towards protectionism. And I think COVID-19 has only served to drive that more and more as countries are realising that actually they need to be more food secure and secure in more and more of their overall supplies of products. So I think we'll see protectionism continuing to increase, and that obviously has impacts on the trade of agricultural material, and that includes canola. And so just to conclude now, I'll just move on to some of the prospects for the future and what we see looking down the track as to the future prospects for canola from an Australian perspective. I think the first one there that's pretty positive is that we're seeing growing consumption of fats and oils around the world. This is all fats and oils. They're continuing to grow, and that's a really positive sign as more and more of the global population is moving out of poverty, moving up that socioeconomic pyramid away from the base, They're increasing their consumptions of meats and proteins generally, or animal protein, but also with that comes the increased consumption of vegetable oils. And that's proving to be positive and quite strong there. You can see from 2013 to 2019, strong and consistent growth from 200 million tonnes of oil and fats consumption to over 230 million in a pretty short period of time. Similarly, specifically on canola oil, ticks all the health boxes. More and more of the global population is becoming more health aware. They're realising the importance of heart health, and canola fits right in that with low levels of saturated fat, high levels of omega-3 and omega-6s, and a good level of monounsaturated fatty acids. So canola certainly ticks those health boxes. We've also been able to demonstrate both in Australia and Canada and Europe that canola is grown sustainably. We wouldn't be able to access the EU biodiesel market if we weren't able to demonstrate strong sustainability credentials around canola. So that's been a strong positive there. And of course, that's had rub off in Australia, at least into other grains as well, as farmers improving their overall sustainability practices. And we're also seeing solid growth for canola protein meal into the feed sector, but also with this global demand around plant protein, significant investment, particularly in North America, into the role of canola meal into human food and trying to capitalise on that human food growth for plant protein. So on the positive side, some pretty good ticks there for canola. However, a couple of cautions to be aware of there, and I think canola is a pretty thirsty crop. It's quite variable or dependent on consistent and stable and predictable weather. Unlike cereals, which are more tolerant, canola's less tolerant, so quite susceptible to climate change. While I talked before about the growing consumption of oils and fats, it's important that canola maintains its share of that growth or increases its share. But what we've seen actually in the last few years is canola not keeping pace with that same rate of growth, which is concerning. Particularly for Australia, that over-reliance on biodiesel, and what does that mean for the future? That's certainly a concern for the Australian market and perhaps in the other canola markets as well. And then the issues around glyphosate and community sentiment towards GM. I think that is something that we as a country and as an industry, but not just the canola industry, but the grains industry generally has to be very cognizant of. And what does that mean for future productivity in the grain sector is the challenge. So that's really what I had to run through today. I hope you've learned something about Australian canola production, and as I've been able to share the Australian perspective on this. And I think by the time you've heard from my colleagues in Germany and Canada and in France, I think you'll have a much clearer picture on the global issues and opportunities facing the global canola industry. So thanks very much for your time, and thanks again to the OGC organisers for a great conference. Well done.